Welcome everyone to our first webinar of 2023, and we are focusing on peer learning, fostering multilingual learners or MLs, oral language development and content understanding. So today it's going to be my co-author and longtime colleague, Dr. Sydney Snyder, and myself facilitating this session. So I'm Diane Stair-Fenner, and I'm the president of Support Ed. If you're on Twitter, there's my Twitter handle. And I am a former ELD teacher, dual language assessment specialist teacher, and ESOL assessment specialist. I spent a great deal of my time in Fairfax County, Virginia, Fairfax County Public Schools outside of DC. And a little more than 10 years ago, I formed our company, which is called Support Ed. And we focus on focusing on supporting and empowering multilingual learners and their educators. We provide professional development and technical assistance and coaching, all in the name of empowering and elevating our multilingual learners. So welcome.
And I'm Sydney Snyder, Principal Associate at Support Ed. I've been with Support Ed for about 11 years, and I was an ELD teacher prior to that. And I am co-author of Unlocking English Learners' Potential with Diane, and also Culturally Responsive Teaching for Multilingual Learners. And I just wanted to say welcome to you all. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about. So we're so excited that you could join us this afternoon.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So, and along those lines, we want to always start in a place of gratitude and express our thanks to you for joining us today. We know that if you're in the classroom, you might have had to arrange for a sub or to make some alternate arrangements to be with us here today. So we just wanted to pause for a moment and say thank you so much for all you're doing to support multilingual learners. And just a couple of housekeeping things as we get started. We'll be using Zoom. You're probably seeing a lot of information coming in on the chat. Some messages from our colleague, Diane Choi. Diane, do you want to wave? She's right down the hall from me. Coming from Diane Choi, will start and end with 3 asterisks. So any questions, any technical issues, just ask them in the chat, and Diane Choi will get back to you. We're also going to use a few icons today just to orient you to these. This one means that something we're referring to is, you'll see it on our Padlet, and we'll be sharing links with that to the Padlet in the chat. This means that we'll have a video activity. We're going to watch one brief video clip. This icon at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen will mean we're going to be discussing via chat, but Sydney and I love it when you just chime in the whole time, talk to each other, react to what you see, ask questions. And then we're also going to have a couple of polls for you here today. So we're excited to get started. For those of you who are able to stay with us till the end, we're going to share a link to a certificate for 1 hour of professional development at the end of the webinar. So you have to stay tuned for that, and we'll share the link with you then. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a Padlet of resources. They're aligned to our objectives from this session today, and this link will remain live after we're done. So we encourage you to use the Padlet, share it, use the resources. Sydney and I, as we mentioned, have been in the classroom before and worked for districts. We're used to reinventing the wheel. We don't want you to have to reinvent the wheel. So we've created a lot of materials and also curated materials from others that we know are to be high quality for you to take and use. So please have at it and use that Padlet. We also want to share with you a link for a raffle to win one of our books of your choosing. Here are a few of the books that either Sydney and I have co-authored, or I've been co-authored as well. So to enter into the raffle, we're going to draw a winner at the end of the session today. You can either use the QR code, or you can click on the link that's gone out in the chat. And again, we will announce this winner at the end of the session, and you can choose your book and we will mail it to you. So we have 3 objectives for our collaboration today. The first is that we'll discuss why peer learning opportunities are essential to multilingual learners' oral language development and understanding of content. And then we'll explore 4 key practices for fostering ML's engagement and participation in peer learning activities. And then you will have the chance to apply peer learning tools and strategies to your work with multilingual learners in your context. So we've introduced ourselves. We would like for you in the chat to share your role and your favorite winter activity. What's your favorite winter activity? I don't know. We have people here from Hawaii, so maybe it's not as wintry as we think, but what's your favorite winter activity and your role? Great. Reading in bed with blankets. Oh yeah, reading in bed. Snowshoeing. Absolutely. Snowshoeing. Great. One of my favorite winter activities is cross-country skiing. And I might take a downhill lesson in a couple of weeks here. I haven't done it since high school, so we'll see if I come hobbling back after that. Wonderful. Oh, so many things. The chat is just rolling in. Watching good shows, downhill skiing, hot tubbing. Oh, wait, I missed that one. That looks like fun. Great. So keep them coming. And I'm going to turn it over to Sydney for our next part.
Great, thank you. So we're going to dive right in and talk about why peer learning and oral language development is so important for our multilingual learners. We want to start with a poll. I would like you to think about how much time during a school day do MLs spend engaged in academic conversation? And I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. And oops. Maybe it already.
Yeah, I already launched it, Sydney.
All right. Okay. So is it 0 to 4%, 5 to 10%, 11 to 20, or 21 to 50? So what do you think? How much time do our multilingual learners spend engaged in academic conversations? Diana, I can't see how many have responded, so I'm going to leave it up to you to decide when to end.
Yeah, for some reason I can't see on my end either. So I'll end it.
All right. So I will share the correct answer was 5 to 10%. For a long time, we cited research that said that MLs only engaged in academic conversations about 2% of the time. This was research cited by Diane August, but Ivania Soto in her more recent ML shadowing work has found that this is closer to 5 to 10%. But what we know is it varies greatly from school to school, classroom to classroom, grade level to grade level, right? So as we go throughout today's webinar, what I'd like you to be thinking about, what are the implications for this data about this small amount of time that our MLs are able to spend talking about this rich academic content. And what we know is that we have a goal of having them spend 30% of their day doing that. So I'll just ask you to keep that in mind as you think about the MLs in your context and ways that we can be increasing that academic talk time. So why is peer learning so important for our multilingual learners? We know it gives them an opportunity to hear that discipline-specific language that they really need to acquire in order to understand and engage with content. It allows for repetition. They get to hear that language multiple times. They get to practice using that language, which helps with their language acquisition, supports language and literacy development. It enhances their understanding, right? We remember things a lot better when we talk about them and engage with them and think about them than if we're just hearing them or just reading about them. And also it supports a lot of other skills. So it builds community, it supports students engaging in problem solving, critical thinking, and a variety of other skills that are really important. So there's a lot of great benefits for our multilingual learners. We also know that the research tells us that oral language piece is really important for our multilingual learners because it helps them develop that academic language that they need. And also it's that integration of oral and written language into content instruction, which again is so important for their learning. And thinking also how we can connect that oral language piece to support students with their writing, right? Often those conversations can be a jumping off point for student writing. And as we're thinking about this oral language piece, increasing these academic conversations, we want to think about how we can shift the model from teacher to student discourse. And we've all seen this model where a teacher asks a question, one student responds, the teacher responds, and it goes back and forth, to this model where students are really having an opportunity to talk with one another about the content, and the teacher is free to circulate, provide support, assess students' understanding. What do you see more in your context? Do you see more teacher-student discourse or more student-to-student discourse, or a good variety of both? What do you think? I'm seeing some teacher-to-student, teacher-to-student. Yeah, and I actually, that's what we see in our work too. So it's very common. So again, let's be thinking about how we can shift to that, have more of that student-to-student discourse. We want to do a waterfall chat now. And for those that you aren't familiar with a waterfall chat, we'll ask you to type in the chat, but not press enter so that we get all the responses at one time. So what I'd like you to do is just take a minute and in a word or short phrase, describe what makes a peer learning opportunity accessible and meaningful for our multilingual learners. So we don't want to just have them have those opportunities for talk, but we want to make sure that they're getting the most out of those opportunities when they are engaging with their peers. And yes, we learned this from Esther Park, so that we love this strategy. I'll give you just 30 seconds. Go ahead and type in the chat, and then I'll tell you when to press enter. Give you just a minute. All right, let's go ahead and go. Ooh, I love it. Lots of scaffolds, build content, scaffolding, predictable structures, explicit instruction, time, visuals, student-friendly language, manipulatives, opportunity for translanguaging, great. Pre-teaching vocabulary, multiple access points. I love all these great ideas. Thank you so much. And we're going to be talking about more of those as we go throughout today's session. So what really are some of our goals for peer learning activities? Again, we want to provide them that opportunity to hear language and practice language. And it's important to keep these goals in mind as we're designing the activities. We want to give students an opportunity to make connections to their learning, connections to their background, connections to what peers have said. We also want it to be structured so that all students can participate. Again, there's always the worry you can ask students to do a turn and talk, right? But if you haven't sufficiently supported your multilingual learner, they might just sit there and let the other person talk or wait. So we'll always be thinking about how we can provide that structure. We want to push student understanding, so they're really having opportunities to think more deeply about the content. And I'll just add, and you can add in the chat, what strategies and routines can educators use to support these goals? So we're thinking about these goals, and now we have to think about what does that look like as we're designing these activities. Again, so what do you think? What are the strategies and routines we can use to support these goals? Great. Sentence frames, cooperative learning, partner A and B, inside-outside circle, small moves. Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to keep going, but feel free to keep adding your ideas. And then when we want to think about how do we support their oral language skill development. So again, thinking about that oral language piece, using activities that develop meaningful, authentic, and robust language. So what is the language we want our students to be using, and how can we help them use it? Using open-ended prompts, right? We know if we ask a yes/no question, the conversation probably isn't going to go very far. And then incorporating activities that provide multiple opportunities to practice. So how can they talk to multiple people? Can they share their ideas in multiple ways? Again, reinforcing that practice with language. So also we want to be having conversations with our students about how we can co-create a culture of authentic and sustained talk. How can we have these discussions so our students know what our goals are? And in some of my coaching work this year, we've been having a lot of discussions with students about what this looks like to have a talk be sustained, right? How do we take students from each student in a pair sharing their idea to having them build on each other's ideas. So again, modeling what it looks like, being clear with students, being explicit about the goal. What is that sustained talk? And then be explicit, give explicit directions for what students can do. So when they're in a pair, what could they do to keep that conversation going? They can restate what their partner said. They can agree or disagree. They can ask for examples. They can ask their partner questions. They can make connections to what they heard. And again, all of these things are things we'd want to model and practice with students. We wouldn't want to put those all out there for them to think about at once, but how can we add so that they're practicing different ways of sustaining their talk? Throughout this webinar, we're going to be sharing a series of activities and strategies. And so the first one I want to introduce is called Dining Partners. And this is a modified version. Some of you may have heard of Clock Partners. So it's a similar idea where the students either select or are given, depending on how you want to structure it, 3 different partners. And then they'll respond to a prompt independently and then share their responses with one dining partner at a time. And again, you could have them have dining partners based on different kinds of intentional grouping, whether you want to have that opportunity for translanguaging or home language practice, if you want to give them language models. So there are different ways that you can use this. As you think about this dining partner activity, what support might our MLs need if they're going to engage in a dining partner activity where they're going to share their ideas with multiple partners? Visuals and sentence frames. Yeah, sentence starters. Great. A ring of sentence frames so they can carry it with them. Nice. Fill in the blank, word bank. Great. All right, please keep adding your ideas, and I'm going to turn it back to Diane.
Great, thank you. Yeah, please do keep sharing your ideas, especially now we're going to move into the 4 key practices that frame our work around peer learning and oral language. So to do that, we're going to watch a brief video, and we have a couple of questions, guiding questions for you to be thinking about that Diane is going to share in the chat, I believe. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can share the video and text aloud so they can hear themselves speak. And that's a big step as well. How about some glows and grows from the video? Many of you mentioned some things that you saw. Is there anything that maybe you hadn't seen, or some advice you would give? If you were coaching this teacher, what might you say? What would some grows be? Yeah, all students could do a choral reading of the learning target. Great. Yeah, thank you. So you can keep contributing here. What do you think? So, yeah. Thank you for those of you who are sharing. So this leads us into our 4 practices to foster ML's engagement and peer learning activities. So we're going to go through each of these 4 and give you some examples and some tools, some practical tools for each. And so you can see the 4 here: coming prepared, being aware of body language, taking turns, and making connection. And this content is from our Unlocking English Learners Potential book. And Diane just shared a link to that as well. So I'm going to share with you just some considerations in coming to the discussion prepared. So we really saw that from this teacher, how she was ensuring her students were prepared. We don't just want to have a discussion and expect our students to readily take part. We want to make sure that we prepare them, we set them up for success. So we want to, first of all, make sure that they fully understand what the prompt or what the task is. And we want to tap into and draw upon their prior knowledge, helping them make connections to previous content and also connections to their background experiences and their lives. We want to think about vocabulary instruction. How can we embed that, keywords and phrases, along with how we use those in context? We want to give our students thinking and writing time to really process and to have them think deeply about ideas, and giving them scaffolds like graphic organizers or text-dependent questions or sentence stems and frames. And then we're, as I mentioned, giving them support for the content. So having them have multiple means of interacting with the content is very important. So we're going to give you some examples of what does it mean to come to the discussion prepared. We see the Freyer model, this example with living things, and the next example is about renewable energies, or for a little bit of an older student group. Our next example is vocabulary support using a KIM strategy. So keyword, important information, and a memory clue. So you can see an example with math, and then an example for with science or migration. Another example is using anchor charts. So here's one for working with math, and we love really seeing how you can embed peer learning and oral language development into mathematics instruction. That's something I've really enjoyed working on with teachers in one of the large districts we're coaching in this year, is embedding the linguistic aspects into mathematics, which is, we know, so heavily dependent on language. So really referring students back to these anchor charts. Another example for coming to the discussion prepared is to prep the reporter. So one person, as we know, when you're working in group, you select one person to share out to the whole group, but then all of the students, this is the twist, are responsible for making sure the reporter is ready to share out. And so you would want to model what it looks like with some familiar content to prep the reporter and make sure you're supporting that person. So what's a strategy that you use to prepare your MLs for discussion? So we've shared some examples to prepare them. So what do you do to prepare your MLs for discussions? You can add in the chat. Do you do some of these, or pre-teaching, think, pair, share, oral rehearsal, giving them practice, modeling? Great. And I'm sure some of you are making connections to what others say. Oh, wow, lots, jotting ideas on index cards, group warm-ups. Wonderful. Yeah, it's just so important to be intentional when we're preparing for discussions to make sure that our multilingual learners do have a great chance to be able to be successful and to build on that success. And let's look at our second area, is to be aware of body language. So let's see a little bit about what that looks like. So our first consideration is to really validate and be aware of our students' home cultures. So validating and just calling to mind that body language expectations might be different in students' cultures, for example. We want to think about expectations, for example, eye contact. We know in many cultures to be respectful is to not make eye contact, but in the US, the expectation is that we're going to look someone in the eye, for example. So we mentioned eye contact. Also, facing what we expect to do here is to face each other when you're speaking, when you're discussing with a student. We expect that you might lean towards the person when you're talking with them. And also you show your understanding through nodding, through following along. But again, it's very important to validate what students bring with them while sharing what the expectation might be in the US. And I'm doing more research and more learning and thinking, for example, of neurodivergent learners in the US might not be as comfortable making eye contact, whether they're multilingual learners or not. So really being inclusive of all of our students and voicing our understandings. So let's look at a strategy. So using a participation protocol, you can have a class anchor chart, introduce it, model it, co-construct it for some of your look-fors. We'd always want to practice with familiar topics and low stress situations, high context, practice with non-academic topics, and use a checklist. And so here's an example of what a checklist might look like. So for that bit of a choppy video that you just saw, so a participation protocol could be this. So we talked about looking at your partner, leaning, lowering your voice in this teacher's classroom, listen attentively and use evidence and examples. So that would be a teacher-facing tool where the teacher could walk around and collect data on students' level of participation. So we also want to have student self-assessments to make sure our students are aware of what the expectations are and can think about how they're participating in peer learning. So for example, we could have them complete a self-assessment checklist and share this with them ahead of time and model it for them. So we link to this tool on the Padlet as well. So we'd like you to think about the second practice to be aware of body language. So what's the way that you assess your students' participation in peer learning activities? And also thinking of their body language in particular. So what do you do? Can you share that in the chat? Yeah, so Doug likes to have a group leader assess their group members using a checklist. Graphic organizer for both partners' ideas. Encourage leaning towards the partner. Exit tickets, sharing sticks, teaching the social skills. Great. Yeah, and that's so important after so much virtual learning. One thing that Sydney and I really noticed, especially last year in classrooms, was that students in general just had a difficult, challenging time speaking with each other, feeling comfortable if they were in a virtual learning environment for a long time. The social aspects, the pragmatics of language, turn taking, knowing what to say, how do you ask a follow-up question? It's so important, and we all kind of got rusty in those areas. So this is why this topic is just very near and dear to our hearts. We love so many wonderful things we're seeing in the districts where we're out doing coaching and professional learning. So we really wanted to share some of these strategies with you today.
Great, thank you. So our next practice is supporting students in taking turns. So again, providing very structured pair work can be one way. For example, if they have to do an information gap or they're completing some kind of graphic organizer where there's an expectation that both students have to participate. Using, as we saw in the video, a talking rock, a talking stick, or discussion chips, where every student has a certain number of chips and then they put their chip in when they speak. And that can be a way to make sure that it's not always the same students talking. It can also be a way during a whole group discussion for teachers or other students to see who hasn't spoken and maybe encourage them or ask a question of those students. Teaching students language for inviting others to participate. So what do you think? What is your ideas? Again, encouraging that group discussion, making sure that we get to hear all the voices. Supporting active listening. So what does it mean to be an active listener? Listening so that you can show that you're interested, but also listening so you can make connections and build on the ideas. And then building in group routines for accountability. So again, we want to make sure not only, we've all seen those group activities or group discussions where it's one or two students doing the majority of the work, right? So how can we make sure that every student has a role and every student has a responsibility? And here are some examples. Here you can see conversation role cards, and these can be used even with kindergarten or first grade, where they know if they're the listener or the speaker at that time, and then when they're changing roles, they can switch. This is from an educator in New York. This is an example to support active listening, an anchor chart. So what does an active listener do? They look at the speaker, they listen, they ask questions. Here's an example of group roles, and this is modified from the San Francisco School District, the math department. So we have this shared on the Padlet, and they have specific roles for math discussion groups, but this has been modified a little. So again, thinking about those group roles and making sure everyone has a role, and there's also, they have an opportunity to practice that language. So here you can see the role along with some language they might use in that role. And I want to share a strategy, numbered heads together, which again is a structured group protocol that encourages accountability for all group members. So this activity works, their students are put in groups. Every student has a number in that group. There's a prompt, they discuss it. And then the teacher decides or picks a number, and every student who's that number from each group has to share out. Another way this can be done is combined with that prep the reporter. So the teacher shares in advance which number it's going to be, and then the whole group is responsible that making sure their reporter is ready to share out, right? We don't want our multilingual learners to be put on the spot. We want to make sure that they're prepared and they're not going to be embarrassed. And we want to have the other students in the group help with that, support them in that. What's a strategy that you're using or would like to use to support students in taking turns during peer learning activities? If you want to go ahead and add it in the chat. And I see we have a question, and we're going to take time at the end to answer questions if that's okay. So if you can hold your thought or your idea, we'll definitely come back to you towards the end of the webinar. Thank you. Bilingual pairs, jigsaw, roll cards and talking chips, numbered heads, different colored dice. And one determines the table to share out, and one determines the group member. Nice, so very random. Talking stick, nice. I love all these ideas. Keep them coming. Ooh, I saw Christina shared a plastic microphone, so it puts the kids in the spotlight, right? So they're the speaker. Nice. Equity sticks, second set partners, again, providing that practice with listening and speaking. Great. Thank you so much. Feel free to keep adding. And the final practice we want to talk about is this idea of making connections. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we don't just want students each sharing their ideas. We want to make sure that these peer learning opportunities are really providing that opportunity for them to make connections with their learning. So teaching and practicing language that they can use when they're making those connections. I agree, I disagree, because this reminds me of, those all the types of language that we can use to help students share the connections that are making. We need to model it for them, right? With everything we do, we model how we make connections and be very explicit in that and why it's important for their learning. There's one teaching channel video in which the teacher uses an elaboration emperor or empress in her whole group share outs. So that person is assigned with, when students, perhaps they share, but they don't fully explain what they're thinking, that elaboration emperor or empress asks their peer to add to their ideas, give an example, make that connection. So that can be a great way, again, to practice those skills. Using hand signals, I saw someone mention that in the chat, and including opportunities for individual and group accountability that I mentioned earlier. So again, you can have mini lessons in which they practice those talk moves or those language skills asking for supporting examples, building on a partner's idea, paraphrasing. And again, you could practice with non-academic topics, familiar topics first, and then move it to the academic content as a way to practice those skills in that language. Here you can see a model of math talk moves, so some language that students might use when they're explaining how they solved a problem and whether they agreed, why it makes sense, something that they have a question about. We shared that on the Padlet. And this is an example of cue signals that you can use with questions to support language use. And I really like these cue signals because once students get used to the cues, you don't even have to ask the question, right? Like, can you make a connection? Oh, can you expand your language? Can you add an example? So they become familiar with these cues, and then they start to add that elaboration automatically when they see your cue. A strategy that we like, again, for supporting that repetition, that adding the opportunity to hear language is the 1-3-6 protocol. So students individually respond to a prompt or develop their idea. They get in a group of 3 and discuss. And then you put 2 groups of 3 together to make a 6, and you ask them to do something more with it. So maybe they're going to put a list of all their ideas and they're going to put a star next to the one that they think is the best idea, or somehow prioritize. So again, having them practice that language, but taking it to kind of a higher level or next level. We're going to now have another poll, and just think about which of the 4 practices would you like to strengthen in your context? Let's see. Am I going to launch it, or for some reason?
I can try. We'll see.
Okay.
We'll see. All right. It says the poll is ended. I don't know.
All right. Just put, oh, you're putting it in the chat perfectly.
Yeah.
I'm seeing a lot of 3s, taking turns, 4s, making connections. Great. 3, I saw a 2, a 1. Nice. Great. Thank you so much. And feel free to keep adding. And I'm going to turn it back to Diane now.
Great. So we're going to wrap up in our last few minutes by talking about how we can apply peer learning tools and strategies. And we're going to share some with you that kind of pull all of our content together. And what I've really loved so far in collaborating with all of you today was all of the examples you've shared of what you're doing already. So I've already learned so much. But we do want to share this checklist to help you when you're developing lessons, and also maybe even more importantly, when you're collaborating, if you're collaborating with content teachers and grade level teachers, to help you determine if you're incorporating these 4 practices. And Sydney and I really love practical tools, taking the research, taking best practice, helping analyze it and turn it into a practical tool that you can use. So you can see here some criteria, you can check yes or no, and then some follow-up steps. And that is for you on the Padlet. And so we wanted to share a couple of more tools with you, some more resources. So for example, more descriptions of some of the oral language activities, like the 1-3-6 protocol. There's a description, some scaffolds, and a place for you to add in some considerations for how you might use it in your classroom. And so we share several oral language descriptions and also some video examples of each. And also we're sharing with you on the Padlet a peer learning activity planning template. So it allows you to reflect a little bit more on each of our 4 practices and have some guiding questions to raise your awareness of how you might incorporate these practices into your own instruction. So that's also shared with you on the Padlet. And so we'd like to give you a moment to share in the chat what's your aha moment, if you had one, from today's webinar. So can you please share that in the chat? What's your aha moment? How important it is for peer conversation, I keep forgetting to put a focus on peer conversation. Yeah, increasing the Kim strategy, striving for 30%, paying attention to body language, social skills. The Kim strategy, yeah, the 30% from Gibbons, absolutely. Right, the percentage of oral language that multilingual learners are currently engaged in, which is an estimate. So we want to point that out that, like Sydney said, it might be more or less depending on the context. Yeah, wonderful. Taking the time to plan. Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Please keep sharing, supporting oral language directions, multitude of strategies. Yeah, thank you. Great. Looks like a lot of aha moments. And we do want to share, we promised in the beginning that for those of you who are here, who stayed with us, we're going to share in the chat. You can click on the link to get your certificate of attendance for this webinar. And you can take it and share it with your administrator if you need to keep track of your professional development hours. So we'd like to say thank you to you and thank you for your time being with us today and being so interactive and engaged.
Where is the link? Excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm like losing, where is the link to the,
Yeah, it's in the chat and it's coming a couple of times. Starts and ends with 3 asterisks. So it just got sent again. Okay, great. And we also wanted to share with you some book study opportunities we have to earn 20 hours of professional development. So there are a couple of links coming in the chat about those book studies. So we offer three of them currently. Here are 2, one on our book, Culturally Responsive Teaching, one on Unlocking English Learners' Potential. And a couple of more opportunities for online courses, strategies for making content accessible to English learners, and culturally responsive teaching for different hours of professional development. So we encourage you to take a look at those. And now the moment that you've been waiting for, the book raffle winner. So Megan Eichelberry, if I'm saying your name correctly, from Colorado. We did a random number generator and your name was called. So we hope you're here in the chat. We'll reach out to you to determine how to get you your book. So yeah, Megan, if you're here, hopefully we'll find you.
Maria just shared they're doing a book study of the culture book in their school.
Great.
So that's exciting to hear. Thanks for sharing.
Exciting. Oh, wonderful. Great. So thank you so much. We do have a few minutes if you'd like to ask any questions in the chat. Sydney and I are happy to stick around.
Or if you want to unmute.
Yeah, Magda.
Yeah, I had a question because I think the video that we watched, it was a secondary English language development course. So I think that there's obviously an emphasis on part of the instructor to, practice oral language development. The challenge that I find, because I work in a mainstream district, where ELs are, independent of their proficiency level for the most part, learning with the native English speaking peers, that especially in secondary is more of an afterthought. Teachers are so focused on content instruction that, in order for them to be proactively and put in place the kind of scaffolds and structures and practice, the structures that ELs need to be able to become orally confident and proficient, are just not happening continuously. So what suggestions do you have? And I venture to think that that's actually the context where most, unfortunately, where most multilingual learners are placed across the United States.
Yeah, and we do, just like you mentioned, we definitely see that more at the secondary level, that there's more of a focus on the content, less of a focus on interaction. So it definitely takes a shift in mindset. So raising awareness, sharing research on the importance of oral language and peer learning and engaging students and increasing academic achievement is what I would recommend. Thinking of putting on your hat as an advocate, and how do you share that in a way that's palatable to those that you work with, to share the sense of urgency around that, I think is a very important first step. Sydney, do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I think also for some teachers, they really need to see what it looks like. I think that can be the challenge. So if you can have an opportunity to do a model an activity or model a scaffold, and have the whole team, I know it can be challenging with coverages and everything, but if you can have a team watch and then discuss, and then think about, oh, how as a team might we use this scaffold, or might we use this activity? Because again, trying to build that consistent use of scaffolds or activities across classes, I mean, that's helpful for all students, and particularly I think when students are changing classes, where they have multiple teachers throughout the day. So they know, oh, okay, this team of 9th grade teachers, they have sentence stems that I could use to refer to, or they use this oral language activity. So I'm familiar with what it looks like, right? Like an inner and outer circle. So again, trying to have consistency on teams, I think can be really helpful. And then trying to model it for them or provide them an example, I think also is helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks
Yeah,
for your
great.
question.
Yeah, great question. When we do, in some districts we work with, we see a whole school rollout focusing on one strategy, where we see it in math, in social studies, and English language arts. And that can be just so powerful. You also want to have the support from the administrators as well. And that's really crucial too. Are there other questions? We have a few more minutes.
Hi, I'd like to know what the name of the video was on the teaching channel so we can access that when we get a chance.
It's called Engaging ELs in Academic Conversations, Academic Discussions.
Thank you.
Sure. And
I
the
will-
teaching channel has a whole series on around strategies for supporting ELs at different levels.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I just shared a link to it in the chat.
Okay.
I
Hi,
believe,
my name's Mary Carlson, and I was wondering what your policy is on sharing the Padlet resources. The reason I'm asking is one of my colleagues is teaching a course using the books that you've referenced here, and I just think it would be nice for professional learning if she also we could look at these together. But I don't want to share it unless it's okay.
Yep, no, please share them. That's why we created them. So please do share it, but also let us know how it's going.
Okay, will do. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Megan Eichelberry, and you had drawn my name for the book, and I was having a little bit of tech issues and had stepped out for a second, but I am here and I would love to have a copy of that.
Great. Our colleague, Michelle Iris, is going to get in touch with you about getting you a copy of the book.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And I see there's a question in the chat about Ivania Soto's book. It's Shadowing Multilingual Learners, but we can put a link to that it's her second edition. We can put a link to that on the Padlet. Oh, it's already there. Diane Choi's already.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Jessica Ambrose. I typed a question in the chat too, but I just wanted to reiterate it. I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for like really, really, really powerful or impactful studies or research that we can share with administrators and teachers to really drive home the importance of oral language and kind of paint a picture of why it's so important that we pay attention to it in the classroom.
Yeah. So on the Padlet, we've linked to Diane August's research synthesis, and she talks a lot about that, the importance of oral language and that academic language piece and why they're so important. So that's kind of one of our go-to resources when we're showing this is what we know. And there's another article I'm trying to think, I think Walkie and Heritage, where they talk a lot about academic language and these conversations and why they're so important. And both of those are on the Padlet.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think we might have time for one more question.
Yeah, I just have a question. I was looking at all the information from the chat and several of the suggestions. Of course, I can't write that fast, and every time I scroll, it goes away. Is there any way that those suggestions or what other teachers do to support different levels of oral language participation or input, can that be shared with us somehow so we can get a wide variety of activities to pull from?
I was, that's funny that you mentioned it. I was thinking it'd be great to compile these ideas. So maybe,
I know
we don't
once
wanna-
it goes out, then they go away. So they kind of have to be copied and pasted right away. But I
Yeah.
don't think I have the ability as a
No.
non-facilitator to make a copy of the chat.
Right. So what we can do is on our end through Zoom, we'll have a copy of the chat, but we can scrub the names and just list some of the strategies that you all mentioned when we send out the link for the webinar.
Okay.
Yeah, when we send the replay of the webinar, it might take us a little longer. It might not be at the same time, but that's something we'd be happy to do, is write down some of the key strategies that you all mentioned that maybe we saw multiple times.
And we have access to the webinar and the bit.ly for a while so that we can learn from it rather than cramming it in our brains in 48 hours kind of thing.
Absolutely. You will.
Okay. Okay. Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I had a quick question. I was wondering if you would do a presentation like this exclusively for content area teachers or administrators who are not trained in ELD. That seems to be my biggest problem as an advocate, is working with teachers and admin who, when they look at the big picture, they're looking at 2 kids in their classroom or such a small percentage of their student population. And then you add in the barrier of not being really proficient with what it means to develop English language, that it just like the barriers they just fly up. So you guys do a great job. And I think they'd be really benefit from a presentation like that.
Yeah, we'd be happy to chat with you. Our emails are right here. And we do that type of thing pretty frequently, especially, in low incidence populations, right? Where people don't think it's worth the time or the effort, but we know it is. And we know a lot of these strategies will benefit other students as well who are already fluent in English. So it has benefits for everyone, really.
And we love presenting to teams of educators with different roles, because really we feel like that has the greatest impact, right? Where teachers can collaborate and talk about what this means in their context for their role.
Yeah, and we love being able to leverage ELD teachers' expertise as well and elevate their roles. So yes, Wendy, thank you. Well, we are at the end of our session, and we want to thank you so much for joining us and for being so interactive and sharing so many great strategies.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Have a great afternoon and evening.